The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the tall, dusty windows of the old estate. Detective Ryan Mallory stood at the edge of the room, staring at the scene before him. The room was a chaotic mess, papers strewn across the hardwood floor, books haphazardly pulled from shelves, and a single, old-fashioned typewriter sitting ominously on a mahogany desk. The unmistakable smell of death hung in the air, sharp and metallic. Famous author Edward Grayson had been found slumped over that very desk, his hands still resting on the keys, eyes wide open, frozen in an expression of sheer terror. The final chapter of his life had ended just as mysteriously as the twisted tales he was known for. The coroner's report would later confirm that his heart had simply given out, but there was something disturbingly wrong about the whole scene. Something that gnawed at the edges of reason. Ryan's eyes were drawn to the thick manuscript lying beside the typewriter. It was bound neatly with twine, the title scrawled in Grayson's familiar handwriting, "The Last Story." Curious, Ryan flipped through the first few pages. The words seemed to pulse with a life of their own, dark and vivid descriptions of murder, pain, and fear leaping off the pages. It was as if the stories were begging to be read, to be set free. One paragraph caught his eye. The killer moved silently, his breath steady as he tightened the garrote around the victim's neck, savoring the slow, painful struggle. It was a dance he had perfected, an art form of death. Ryan felt a chill creep down his spine. The details in the manuscript were disturbingly accurate, almost as if the writer had witnessed the crimes himself. But that was impossible, wasn't it? The detective had been on the force long enough to know that some things defied explanation, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Grayson's death than met the EYE. As he continued reading, a pattern began to emerge. Each story in the manuscript detailed a different murder, all eerily similar to unsolved cases from the past year. Cases that had baffled even the most seasoned detectives in the department. Grayson had somehow documented these crimes with a precision that was unsettling. But how? Ryan's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the phone to call in a forensic team. The sound of the dial tone was loud in the quiet room, almost deafening. But before he could press a single button, the phone rang, sharp and shrill, breaking the suffocating silence that he hesitated for a moment before answering. Mallory. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a soft, raspy voice. "Detective Mallory, do you enjoy stories?" Ryan's blood ran cold. Who is this? Someone who appreciates the art of storytelling, someone who knew Edward Grayson very well. Ryan's grip tightened on the phone. "If you had anything to do with Grayson's death, I will find you," the voice chuckled, low and sinister. "You won't have to, detective. You see, the next story has already been written, and this time, you're in it." The line went dead. Ryan slowly lowered the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the room into darkness. He could barely make out the outline of the manuscript in the fading light. A creeping dread filled the air, as if the shadows themselves were alive, watching him, waiting. He knew, without a doubt, that this was just the beginning. Ryan sat at his desk in the dimly lit office, the manuscript lying in front of him like a ticking time bomb. The words of the mysterious caller echoed in his mind, twisting his thoughts into a labyrinth of fear and paranoia. How could someone be documenting real murders with such accuracy? And why had Grayson been the conduit? He couldn't shake the feeling that the manuscript was more than just a collection of stories, it was a blueprint, a map to something far darker. But what? Ryan reached for his coffee cup, his hand trembling slightly as he took a sip. The bitterness did nothing to quell the growing unease in his gut. He had seen countless crime scenes, dealt with the worst humanity had to offer, but this was different. This was personal. As he stared at the manuscript, an idea formed in his mind. He grabbed a notepad and began to compare the stories to the unsolved cases. The similarities were chilling. Each story matched a crime scene perfectly, right down to the smallest detail. The exact placement of the body, the specific injuries inflicted, even the time of death. It was as if the killer was using Grayson to chronicle his work, a twisted form of artistic expression, but how? Grayson had been a recluse, rarely leaving his estate. There were no signs of a break-in, no indications that anyone had been in his house other than him. And yet, the murders had been documented with such precision that it was impossible to dismiss the connection. Ryan decided he needed to dig deeper into Grayson's life, to find out who might have had access to him. He pulled up the author's contacts, editors, publishers, even a few close friends. The list was short, a testament to Grayson's isolated existence. One name stood out, Rachel Everly, Grayson's editor, and the only person who had been in regular contact with him in the months leading up to his death. Ryan grabbed his coat and keys, the manuscript tucked under his arm. He needed answers, and Rachel seemed like the best place to start. The sun had fully set by the time Ryan arrived at Rachel Everly's apartment. The building was old, the kind with creaky floors and dim hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, and Rachel stood before him, a petite woman with dark hair and tired eyes. "Detective Mallory," she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. "Miss Everly, I need to talk to you about Edward Grayson," Ryan said, trying to keep his voice steady. Rachel's face fell. She stepped aside to let him in, motioning for him to sit on the worn leather couch. The apartment was cluttered, books and papers stacked in every corner, a reflection of someone who lived more in words than in the real world. "I still can't believe he's gone," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper as she sat across from him. "He was brilliant." "Troubled, but brilliant," Ryan nodded, sensing her genuine grief. "I need to ask you about the manuscript. The last story. Did you know about it?" Rachel's eyes widened, and she shook her head. "No. I mean, he always worked on multiple projects, but he never mentioned that one specifically." "What's it about?" Ryan handed her the manuscript, watching her face as she flipped through the pages. As she read, her expression shifted from curiosity to horror. These are real?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," Ryan replied. "Every story matches a real murder case. Someone was feeding him these details, and I need to know if you have any idea who it could be." Rachel closed the manuscript, her hands shaking. "Edward was paranoid. He always thought someone was watching him, controlling him. He said he could feel someone else in his head, pushing him to write things he didn't want to." "Did he ever mention who?" "No, but he started seeing someone, a therapist. He said she helped him focus, but after a while, he became more withdrawn. He wouldn't even talk to me about what he was working on. I thought it was just another one of his creative phases." Ryan's mind raced. A therapist? That could be the connection he was looking for. "Do you know the therapist's name?" Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "Dr. Evelyn Moore. She has a practice downtown. I think she might know more than she let on." Ryan stood, a sense of urgency propelling him forward. "Thank you, Rachel. I'll look into it." As he turned to leave, Rachel called after him. "Detective, please be careful. Edward, he wasn't himself these last few months. Something changed in him. I'm afraid. Whatever it was, it's still out there." Ryan nodded, his resolve hardening. Whatever had twisted Grayson's mind, whatever had pushed him to write those stories, was still out there, lurking in the shadows. And it was time to bring it into the light. The rain fell in relentless sheets as Ryan drove through the dark streets, the city lights blurred and distorted through the windshield. His mind was a whirl of questions and half-formed theories. Dr. Evelyn Moore, could she be the key to unraveling the mystery? Was she the one feeding Grayson the details of those murders, pushing him to document them in his final manuscript? And if so, why? The closer he got to her office, the more the sense of foreboding grew. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm to break. When Ryan finally pulled up outside the office building, the place was eerily deserted, the kind of quiet that screamed of something waiting in the wings, something unseen. Ryan stepped out of the car, his coat pulled tight against the rain. The building loomed above him, dark and imposing, its windows like dead eyes watching his every move. He pushed through the heavy glass doors and made his way to the elevator, his footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. Doctor Moore's office was on the 10th floor. As the elevator ascended, Ryan's heartbeat quickened. His instincts, honed by years of chasing criminals and navigating dark alleys, screamed at him that something was off. The whole situation felt wrong, like a trap he was willingly walking into. The elevator doors slid open with a soft ding, revealing a dimly lit hallway. Ryan's hand instinctively moved to his gun, his fingers brushing the cool metal as he stepped out. Dr. Moore's office was at the end of the hall, the only light visible coming from beneath the door. He approached cautiously, his senses on high alert. The door was slightly ajar, a crack of light spilling into the hallway. Ryan hesitated, listening for any sounds from within. Hearing nothing but the low hum of the building, he pushed the door open. The office was small and sparsely furnished, the kind of place designed to make patients feel at ease. A leather armchair sat opposite a desk cluttered with papers and books. But it wasn't the office that drew Ryan's attention, it was the woman sitting behind the desk. Dr. Evelyn Moore was striking, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to pierce through the gloom. She didn't look surprised to see him. In fact, she almost looked as if she had been expecting him. "Detective Mallory," she said, her voice smooth and calm. "I've been expecting you." Ryan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Dr. Moore, I need to ask you some questions about Edward Grayson." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. I've been following his case closely. Such a tragic loss. He was a brilliant man, but troubled. You were his therapist. You must have known he was struggling," Ryan said, watching her carefully for any sign of deception. Dr. Moore nodded. "Yes, he came to me because he was experiencing severe paranoia and hallucinations. He believed someone was controlling his thoughts, influencing his writing. He was terrified, but he couldn't stop writing." "What did you do to help him?" "I tried to ground him in reality, to help him differentiate between his imagination and the real world. But it was difficult. He was so deeply entrenched in his stories, so convinced that they were real. And in a way, they were, weren't they?" Her eyes locked onto Ryan's, her gaze uncomfortably intense. Ryan's hand tightened around the manuscript he had brought with him. "You knew, didn't you? You knew what he was writing was real." Dr. Moore's smile widened, a cold, predatory expression that sent a shiver down Ryan's spine. "I didn't just know, Detective. I encouraged it." The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing down on Ryan's chest. He could feel the weight of her words, the truth hidden within them. "Why? Why would you do that?" "Because stories have power," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They shape reality, influence minds. Edward was special. He had a gift, a connection to something greater. He could tap into the darkness, draw it out, and give it form. I simply helped him channel it." Ryan's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "You manipulated him, used him to document those murders. But for what? To what end?" Dr. Moore leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving his. "To feed the darkness. To give it a voice, a presence in this world." Edward's stories were more than just words on a page, they were rituals, summoning the very essence of evil. "And now, Detective, it's time for the final chapter." Ryan's blood ran cold. He knew then that he had walked right into her trap. The room seemed to close in around him, the shadows deepening, swirling at the edges of his vision. He reached for his gun, but his movements felt slow, as if he were moving through water. "You see, Detective," Dr. Moore continued, her voice echoing in his mind, "Edward's last story was unfinished. He was meant to write the final chapter, but he couldn't. That's where you come in." Ryan's vision blurred, the room spinning as a wave of dizziness crashed over him. He staggered, gripping the edge of the desk for support. The manuscript slipped from his grasp, falling to the floor with a soft thud. "Don't fight it," Dr. Moore whispered, her voice surrounding him. "You're part of the story now." Ryan's thoughts became disjointed, fragments of fear and confusion mixing with the darkness that was seeping into his mind. He could feel it, the presence she had spoken of, something ancient and malevolent, clawing its way into his consciousness. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was Dr. Moore's face, twisted into a grotesque mask of triumph. Ryan awoke in darkness, his head pounding, his limbs heavy as if they were weighed down by invisible chains. He was lying on a cold, hard surface, the scent of damp stone and old paper filling his nostrils. Panic gripped him as he tried to move, only to find that his hands were bound tightly behind his back. A rough rope dug into his wrists, the coarse fibers biting into his skin. Slowly, his eyes adjusted to the dim light. He was in a small, windowless room, the walls lined with shelves crammed full of books and papers. The only light came from a single, flickering candle on a nearby table, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like restless spirits. His breath quickened as he tried to piece together what had happened. The last thing he remembered was Dr. Moore's voice, her words wrapping around his mind like a serpent, squeezing until he lost consciousness. Now, he was here, wherever here was, trapped and helpless that he struggled against the bindings, but they only tightened with his efforts. The more he fought, the more his mind filled with a creeping sense of dread. He wasn't just bound physically, something else was holding him captive, something that lurked in the corners of his thoughts, whispering dark promises and feeding his fear. A rustling sound drew his attention to the far corner of the room. Ryan's heart skipped a beat as he saw a figure emerge from the shadows, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a pale, sickly complexion. His clothes were tattered, his skin stretched tight over his bones. He looked like a ghost, something not entirely of this world. The man stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. In his hands, he held the manuscript, the same one that had led Ryan down this dark path. The sight of it sent a surge of terror through him, but he forced himself to speak, his voice hoarse and trembling. Who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed the manuscript on the table, his bony fingers lingering on the cover as if it were a precious artifact. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper, raspy and broken. "I am the author of your fate, Detective." Ryan's mind raced, searching for some way out of this nightmare. "What do you want from me? Why are you doing this?" The man's hollow eyes met Ryan's, and for a moment, the detective thought he saw a flicker of something human in them, regret, sorrow, perhaps even fear. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a cold, malevolent determination. "The stories must be completed," the man said, his voice gaining strength. "The final chapter must be written." Ryan's pulse quickened. "What final chapter? What are you talking about?" The man moved closer, his skeletal frame looming over Ryan like a specter of death. Edward Grayson's work was unfinished. His stories, they were not just tales of fiction. They were transcriptions of real events, events that I fed to him. He was my vessel, my scribe. But he was weak. He couldn't handle the truth, the weight of the darkness I showed him. It broke him. Ryan felt a chill crawl up his spine as the man continued. "But you, detective, you are different. You have seen the darkness, faced it head-on. You are strong enough to finish what Edward could not." "Finish what?" Ryan demanded, his voice rising with desperation. "What do you want me to do?" The man smiled, a grotesque twist of his lips that revealed blackened teeth. "Write the final chapter. Complete the story. Only then will you be free." Ryan's mind reeled. The idea was madness, but he could feel the man's words burrowing into his brain, twisting his thoughts. He wanted to resist, to fight back, but the darkness was already seeping into him, filling the cracks in his resolve. The man reached into his tattered coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and a pen. He placed them on the floor in front of Ryan, just out of reach. "Write," he commanded, his voice echoing with unnatural authority. "Write the final chapter, or you will remain here forever." Ryan stared at the notebook, the urge to reach for it growing stronger with each passing second. He knew that if he started writing, if he gave in to the darkness, he might never be able to stop. But the alternative, being trapped in this place, at the mercy of this twisted figure, was even more terrifying. With a shaky breath, he inched forward, straining against the ropes until his fingers brushed the edge of the notebook. The moment he touched it, a jolt of electricity shot through him, and his vision blurred. The room seemed to warp and shift around him, the walls closing in as the shadows deepened. The man's voice cut through the fog in Ryan's mind. "Write, detective. Write your story. Write your end." Ryan's hand trembled as he picked up the pen, the darkness wrapping around him like a shroud. His thoughts were no longer his own, the words pouring onto the page as if guided by an unseen hand. The detective sat alone in the darkness, his mind unraveling as the shadows closed in. The truth was finally clear: there was no escape, no hope. The darkness had claimed him, and there was nothing left but to succumb. As he wrote, Ryan felt his strength fading, his well-being consumed by the story. The words flowed faster and faster, the ink soaking into the paper like blood. His vision dimmed, the world around him dissolving into nothingness, and then, just as the final sentence formed in his mind, a loud crash shattered the silence, the door to the room burst open, and the harsh glare of a flashlight cut through the darkness. Voices filled the room, urgent and commanding. "Ryan. Detective Mallory. Are you in here?" Ryan blinked, disoriented, as the shadows retreated. He looked down at the notebook in his hands, the pen slipping from his grasp. The final sentence remained unfinished, the page smudged with ink and sweat. Strong hands grabbed him, pulling him to his feet, freeing him from the ropes that had bound him. As the world came back into focus, Ryan realized he was surrounded by police officers, their faces etched with concern. "Detective, we've been looking for you for hours." "Are you okay?" one of them asked, his voice laced with relief. Ryan tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his mind a jumble of fear and confusion. He glanced around the room, searching for the gaunt man who had forced him to write, but there was no sign of him. The room was empty, the manuscript gone, only the notebook remained, clutched tightly in his hand. As they led him out of the building, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him, lurking just out of sight. He had escaped, but the final chapter was still unfinished. And he knew, deep down, that the story wasn't over, not yet. The days that followed were a blur for Ryan. He was back in his apartment, surrounded by the familiar, yet everything felt foreign, tainted by the darkness he had encountered. The notebook sat on his coffee table, an innocuous object that carried the weight of 1,000 horrors. He hadn't opened it since that night, but he could feel it, a presence, pulsing from within its pages, as if the words themselves were alive. The police had found him in an abandoned building miles from Dr. Moore's office, though no one could explain how he had gotten there. The building was decrepit, slated for demolition, yet somehow, it had become the setting for his nightmare. And Dr. Moore? She had vanished without a trace, as if she had never existed. Ryan's colleagues had urged him to take time off, to rest and recover, but rest was impossible. The shadows followed him everywhere, seeping into his thoughts, his dreams. He knew he was not alone, even when there was no one else in the room. Something was unfinished, lurking just beyond the edge of his consciousness, waiting. He was haunted by the last words he had written in that notebook, the words that had almost claimed him. The story was incomplete, the final chapter unwritten. And he knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that it wouldn't be over until he finished it. That night, Ryan sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the notebook. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, counting down the seconds as he battled the urge to open it. He had to know the truth, to understand what had happened, but he feared what he might find. Finally, with trembling hands, he reached for the notebook. The leather was cool and smooth under his fingers, the pages slightly yellowed with age. He hesitated for a moment, then opened it. The first few pages were filled with his own handwriting, the frantic scrawl of a mind on the brink of collapse. He flipped through them, his pulse quickening as he approached the last page, the one he had left unfinished. The sentence he had begun that night was still there, but something was different. The ink seemed darker, thicker, almost as if it had bled through the page. And there, below his own writing, was another sentence, a new one that he hadn't written. The detective thought he could escape, but the story had other plans. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't possible. No one else had touched the notebook, yet the words were there, written in a hand that was eerily similar to his own but subtly different. darker. He turned the page, his breath catching in his throat as he saw what lay beneath. The rest of the notebook was filled with text, page after page of dense, sprawling script, recounting events that hadn't happened yet. His events. His thoughts, his fears, his actions over the past few days, all laid out in excruciating detail. It was as if someone had been watching him, documenting every moment, every decision. The final page, however, was blank except for a single sentence, scrawled in large, jagged letters: "Finish the story, detective. Or it will finish you." Ryan dropped the notebook, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The darkness in his mind surged, threatening to swallow him whole. He had to fight it, had to resist the pull, but the command echoed in his head, relentless: "Finish the story." He had no choice. He knew that now. Whatever this was, it wouldn't stop until the final chapter was complete. The story was demanding an ending, and it would take him with it if necessary. With a deep breath, Ryan picked up the pen that lay beside the notebook. He flipped to the final blank page, his heart pounding in his chest like a drumbeat of doom. The shadows in the room seemed to close in around him, the air growing thick with anticipation, and then he began to write. The words flowed from his mind like a poison, dark and insidious, spreading across the page in a torrent of fear and despair. He wrote of the detective, trapped in a web of darkness, hunted by unseen forces. He wrote of the gaunt man, the twisted puppeteer who had controlled everything from the beginning. And he wrote of the final confrontation, the moment when the detective would face the truth, when the story would demand its ultimate sacrifice. But as he wrote, Ryan realized something terrible. The story wasn't just about the detective. It was about him. He was the detective, and this was his story, his fate being written in real time. The lines between fiction and reality blurred, and he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The shadows in the room thickened, coiling around him like a living thing. The air grew cold, the temperature dropping as if the very life was being sucked out of the space. And in the corner of his eye, Ryan saw movement. A figure emerging from the darkness, the same gaunt, hollow-eyed man who had haunted his nightmares. The man stepped forward, his presence oppressive, his eyes locked onto Ryan's. "You know what must be done," he whispered, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Ryan's hand shook as he wrote the final lines, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The words formed on the page, sealing his fate, binding him to the story. The detective understood, finally, that there was no escape. The story had claimed him, body and soul. He had become part of it, a character trapped in a tale of darkness, a puppet to forces beyond his control. And as the final sentence was written, he knew the truth: there was only one way out. Ryan's breath hitched as he wrote the last word. The notebook fell from his hands, the pen clattering to the floor. The room was silent, the shadows still, as if waiting for something, and then, in the suffocating silence, Ryan understood what he had to do. The story was over, but his part in it was not. There was only one way to end it, truly end it, and he knew what that meant. He stood slowly, his movements mechanical, as if controlled by an invisible force. The weight of the story pressed down on him, suffocating, inevitable. He moved to the drawer where he kept his service weapon, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the gun as he pulled it out. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse with anticipation, closing in around him. He could feel the presence of the story, alive and hungry, waiting for its conclusion. Ryan raised the gun to his temple, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The darkness whispered to him, urging him on, promising an end to the torment, an escape from the story. With a final, shuddering breath, Ryan pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the apartment, loud and final. The shadows recoiled, retreating as if satisfied. The notebook lay on the floor, open to the final page, where the last sentence glistened in wet ink. The story was complete, and as the darkness consumed the room, the story, the nightmare, finally came to an end.